Hello everybody, I'm Terry Fisher from NQA, the Principal Assessor for Occupational Health and Safety Management Systems. The webinar this afternoon is looking at the migration from OHS 18001 to ISO 45001 and the migration process. If you have a question during the presentation, by all means type your question and I'll try to answer them as we go. If there's several questions of the same theme, I'll try and collectively pull them together. Just bear in mind when you're asking questions, I can't answer specific questions regarding particular organisations. I can only answer generic questions about the management system generally and the various things related to the assessment process. So, firstly, let's look at why we're implementing or looking to implement 45001 and the migration from 18001. What we want to do is enhance performance. This is about protecting workers. The primary core of this management standard is about protecting workers. And we deliberately use the term workers in 45001 to include subcontracted workers, agency workers, external agencies, etc., etc. So it's an all-encompassing phrase used throughout. So we're looking at increasing and improving performance in occupational health and safety, adopting a risk and opportunity approach within the management system, looking at risk-based thinking and worker engagement, a systematic approach to reduce culpability and increase protection both of the workers and therefore of the organisation itself, enhancing leadership, delivering actions and improvements over time with a proven commitment to improvement and continual improvement on performance. First questions come in talking about the presentation slides. Everybody that's registered and either participating this afternoon directly or registered in the webinar will receive the presentation, and the presentation is also recorded, so you can, if you're not available this afternoon directly, you can play it back at your own leisure and catch up on what you've missed. So both the presentation and the recording is available to everybody that's registered as part of the webinar audience. As some of you may be aware, the migration of 18001 to 45001 includes the introduction of the ISO management system structure, which is Annex SL. This is a standard format that's been applied to all ISO management systems, including 9001 2015 and 14001 2015. So they all have the same headings for each of the disciplines. So 9000, 14000 and 45 all have the same headings for each of the relevant chapters of the standard. The actual clauses themselves will differ depending on each discipline, and they are discipline specific, but the general structure of the standards throughout has been standardized, which can help organizations structure their management systems for integration. It gives a common framework to which to develop the management system generally. So it's generally seen as an enhancement. The structure that is divided into 10 chapters, as you can see here. The first 3 refer to the actual ISO standard itself, the scope, the normative references, and the terms and definitions. The terms and definitions are very useful within the standard because it explains what the standard is looking for when it uses those terms throughout the various clauses of the standard. The actual assessment process focuses on chapters 4 to 10 inclusively. So first 3 talk about the standard and the terms and definitions used within, but the actual assessment process looks at the operational application and the structure and the commitment, etc., of the chapters numbered 4 to 10. And as I say, these are common headings across all ISO management system standards that have adopted the Annex SL structure. So we'll take a closer look at the standard clauses. The standard is trying to achieve a cultural change and improved OHS performance, and the primary goal of that performance is looking at increased protection and prevention of injury and ill health to workers. Section 4, the context of the organisation considers external issues and internal issues and activities and the purpose of the organisation itself. So basically, what does the organisation do? Why does it do it? What is it trying to achieve? And all the various things that pull and push an organisation and shape it into what it is and help define its culture. Also in section 4, we look at interested parties. Who's interested? What are they interested in? Why are they interested? How do we meet that need, that interest, that requirement? The core interested party within 45001 is the worker group. So, and as I said earlier, that worker group can include direct employees at all levels, including managers, directors, etc. Everybody's health and safety is considered, but it also includes external factors, subcontractors, anybody that can be influenced or affected by the work activity. Interested parties can also include enforcement organisations and agencies. Depending on, here in the UK, we've got the HSE, for example. But as this is an international standard, that organisation can be local to your geographical location. So we might use the term HSE in the UK, but your own geographical location may have their own arrangements. Workers are the core interested group when it comes to interested parties. And it's that link between those requirements of those interested parties and the various things that is one of the primary drivers. So the context of the organisation, what the organisation is, what the organisation does, who's involved in it, who's interested in it, the leadership style, the stakeholders, what the organisation is trying to achieve is a core element of the management standard. In section 5, the standard looks at the strategy of the organisation relating to policy and the defining of the policy, looking at the roles and responsibilities, and the participation of individuals and groups within that organisation to influence and actively engage with the management system, rather than it just being something that's done to a group of people or whatever. This standard really looks at that participation of workers and encouraging that cross-pollination of ideas and integration into the communication process to ensure that people are engaged and see the value of what's trying to be achieved. In section 6, we've got the planning, so it's looking at the hazard identification, looking at risks and opportunities. So in the context of the organisation, risk and opportunity isn't just the health and safety risks and opportunities that we would traditionally consider, but it's also the risks and opportunities for the business. So it's got to consider the commercial activities, why it's doing a particular thing in a particular way, because all these can influence how an organisation operates and why it chooses to operate in a particular way. So it also looks at the commercial risks and opportunities and the strategic direction of the organisation in the planning activity. Compliance obligations may be statutory, so obviously the ones that are coming from a legal compliance requirement, but they can also come from internal parties. There may be worker agreements that are already in place, union agreements, various things. There could be customer requirements that are influencing the organisation on what it does and how it does it. All these can be considered as compliance obligations and should all relate to the interested parties that we talked about earlier. As an output of that planning, then there's the identification of OHS objectives in relation to what does the organisation want to improve, what does it want to achieve, what does it need to know, etc. And objectives need to be identified, and not only just identified, but plans of how they're going to be delivered. Then the management standard goes on to look at the support and the operations. So the resources, what resources are required for you to do what you need to do in a safe and productive manner. The competence of the workers and the people expected to do particular activities. The awareness of their roles and their understanding of the activities required, understanding of the hazards, the various things, the controls. So you can see it links into a complete communication cycle. Communications, what's being communicated, what you're trying to achieve by the communication is also considered. And documented information. So documented information is looking at anything, so it could be things that are already established, things that you already communicate, data that's already been analysed and considered. So the controls related to documented information, why do you have that information, what are you trying to achieve, use that information should then influence how the system is performing and how you want it to develop. So it's a two-way activity, using the documented information within the management system to best effect to deliver both continual improvement and operational control. The standard talks about, in operational terms, the hierarchy of control, change management, procurement, contractor control, and emergency preparedness. We'll go on to these in a little bit more detail later. And the evaluation improvement section, which is closing the cycle, looking at internal audit, management review, incident and corrective actions, improvement objectives and the achievement thereof, and the improvement process, how that then needs to be reviewed to ensure that it's delivering the benefit. So that's a very brief overview of all the 10 chapters of the standard. We'll go on now to look at more of that. We've just received another. One of the questions that's just been asked is, do we need to have a safety committee? You need to have mechanisms for communication with workers. In the UK, there is requirements under legislation for communication and consultation. Safety committees are mentioned as one format. You also need to look at, it's about the effectiveness of the communication and what you're trying to achieve by the activities of whatever committee or group that you're looking at. And it will depend on the requirements of your own organisation, how it's structured, you know, whether it's got recognised union activity there. So you do need mechanisms for communicating safety and occupational health and safety within your organisation. A committee is one way of doing that. It's not the only way, and as I say, the standard is quite flexible in its approach, but it must be effective and you must have effective means. So communication, you know, a committee is one method, but there'll be informal methods. There could be suggestion schemes, etc., to supplement all the activities. But it's down to the organisation to define what it needs and how best to provide that culture of open communication and participation. So I hope that answers the safety committee question. So within the standard and the context of the organisation, before defining the scope of the operations of the OHS management system, you must understand the context, what the organisation is about, what it's trying to achieve, what it does. You must understand the workers and the relevant interested parties, and you must understand the leadership and the strategic direction of the organisation and the culture of the organisation before you then define the scope of the management system. So let's just expand on that a little bit within the context of the organisation. A water company, for example, is a public limited company, it could be a public limited company, and its needs and requirements, its interested parties, could be very different to a university, an educational establishment. But they can all use the same management system structure to identify what they need to do, how they need to do it, who's interested, what are they interested in, have we delivered that interest, do we need to deliver that interest, etc. That's the process that the management system is trying to take you through. So it's important that you understand each individual type of organisation, maybe doing something very similar to the organisation a few doors down the road or whatever, but I'll guarantee that every organisation has its own uniqueness, is its own individuality. So therefore, even though you may be doing something very similar to somebody else, you may not be doing it in the same way, you may not have the skills, the resources or whatever, that it could be very different. The context of the organisation of a food company, a food manufacturer will be very different to that of the university and the water company. And, you know, put that into context of a family-owned engineering company, which might be a small enterprise, that would be very different. So that's just giving you a taste of what the context of the organisation is trying to establish. Some of this will already be readily understood within the organisation. This isn't necessarily anything new. This is just the connectivity between the context of the organisation and the practicalities of what's driving the business and what's making the business make decisions to do a particular thing, and also to remain compliant with its obligations, both in terms of statutory and meeting the needs of the interested parties, because that's one of the core delivery points of the management system, is to remain legally compliant, meet the needs and expectations of the interested parties, and deliver objectives, deliver the policy, whilst enhancing continual improvement over time. These are all core considerations of the management system and why you're implementing them. As I say, each organisation is different, and the external and internal factors of the interested parties need to be considered. The clauses within section 4, so it's understanding the organisation, its context, understand the needs and expectations of workers. So it's a given that the workers are a core interested party within the OHS management system, and other interested parties, so they are yet to be defined. But workers, and I say the term workers as we discussed earlier, is a deliberate phrase to be all-encompassing, not just direct employees and not just workers at a particular level, but all workers, both from managing directors right the way through. They're all workers for the organisation and therefore need to be looked after. Just got a question here. What is the specific definition of an opportunity, and can you give me an example? I'll refer you to the standard with return in terms of opportunity, but it could be an opportunity, for example, to adopt a new working method because technology's changed. Traditionally, a number of years ago in construction companies, people used to have to manhandle the raw materials, the bricks and the building blocks on hods, etc., and climb ladders whilst carrying a hod, etc. All that has changed with working practices and technology. So there's been an opportunity to develop improved work methods that reduce risk and are opportunities for improvement within the management system. So that's an example of, and there are potentially thousands of opportunities there. You could consider that every risk is an opportunity for improvement. So therefore, I would say look at the standard in terms of specific definitions for opportunity. But it's an opportunity that may be considered both commercially, due to a change in technology, or we've got an opportunity commercially to go into a new sector of activity. There's a new demand for a particular product that we are able to deliver. So therefore, the organisation may choose that in part of its strategic direction, and therefore that can influence what you do and how you do it, which has an impact on the OHS management system. Hopefully that gives you a flavour of when we talk about opportunities, that's what we're looking at. There can also be opportunities in terms of, let's say, organisational knowledge. People may not have an understanding of a particular thing, and therefore by delivering training and awareness of particular technology or activities or whatever, then that can be an opportunity for improvement to increase people's awareness. So opportunities are many and varied, and as I say, every risk potentially is an opportunity for improvement. So it's a double-edged sword in that respect. Going back to the context of the organisation, the clause is there. Determining the scope of the management system is a requirement of that, and the scope does need to be documented. There's also then an OHS management system general requirement of what the management system is setting out to achieve within clause 4.4. When we're looking at context, there's various methods that can be adopted within an organisation. Pestel analysis is one of them. Internal factors, consider the strategy, the structure, the style, the staff, the skills that are already there, the systems that are already deployed, the culture, the shared values of an organization. All these things can have an influence on how the business operates and why the business does what it does. Context, as I say, is a common element of all the revised management systems. So there's some examples there in the slide: workers, managers, contractors, agency staff, regulators, customers, visitors, and members of the public in terms of 45. But there's also customers, communities, suppliers, regulators, etc. And a lot of these interested parties would be common across multidiscipline standards. But it's for the organisation to identify its own particular needs and requirements there in terms of workers, interested parties. The one core one for 45 is workers. And like I say, that is the core interested party for 45,001, which differs from 14,000 and 9,000. The scope of the management system must be documented, and it can only be defined after considering the context and the various workers and interested parties. In section 5, the standard goes on to look at the leadership and worker participation. There's a deliberate change in terminology against 18,001, where it was management. The term leadership is an active engagement in, whereas management could just be the appointment of roles and responsibilities. Leadership and the strategic activities of an organisation will need to be thoroughly investigated as part of the process of assessment. And it's very important that leaders of an organisation are engaged with the management system and understand the importance of what they do and how that can impact on the performance of the OHS management system in relation to workers, and include themselves as the workers as part of that. You know, it's very important that if considerations for stress, etc., are considered for senior leaders and other various levels within an organisation. And it's about this participation of all groups that can influence the management system. So leadership is a key element to that, which is been expanded and enhanced in comparison to 18,001. The policy needs to be defined and documented and communicated, and it talks about safety and healthy working conditions and the prevention of worker injury and ill health. So it's not just about cut fingers and physical accidents, it's about the overall well-being and occupational health of the organisation's workers at all levels. As I say, it's not just about cut fingers, which sometimes get overlooked, the other elements of that. But mental health is certainly in the UK a talking point, and has been for quite a period of time, and it's developing quite strongly now. And the management system is there to help deliver some of these requirements if they're identified within your organisation, and they should be considered in equal importance to the accidents, the injuries, and the physical things. It really is important that the culture of the organisation and how it works is considered and defined. The policy needs to be documented and communicated, as I've just said, and that also then leads to, and there's requirements there for the policy in terms of meeting statutory and legal obligations and compliance obligations, the commitment to continual improvement, the commitment to the management system and adequate resources, etc., which should all come from the leadership. A question here about should the policy clearly state occupational, e.g. OHS, rather than just health and safety. Technically, I say it should. However, because we're talking about occupational health and safety specifically within this standard. But I've never come across a situation where we would raise any findings against the phrase health and safety, because it's how that's interpreted, how that's worked, as long as that commitment is there and the understanding about the needs of the health and safety and the well-being of the individuals. And it's talking about it in a occupational framework, because that's what this standard is particularly looking at. But I would never directly raise any findings against a policy that said health and safety policy in relation to occupational health and safety policy, although occupation is a key word used within the standard. The other sections within section 5 and leadership is looking at organisational roles and responsibilities. The phrase accountabilities has been dropped. Roles and responsibilities also need to have documented information so that they are adequately communicated, the communication is understood, etc. People need to understand what the role expectation is. They need to understand how it fits into the structure. They need to understand their part and what's expected of them as individual workers to deliver their roles and responsibilities. Very important element here in leadership is 5.4, the consultation and participation of workers. It's a key element, and this has been developed over time from the draft standard as it was being developed to replace OHSAS 18001, and it really emphasises the enhancement within the standard of this participation. And that participation is an expectation at all levels of the management system, both from the policy, the risk assessments, the hazard identifications, the opportunities, the improvements, etc. So it's having that meaningful culture within an organisation to deliver the benefit that the standard is looking for and what the organisation's identified that it needs. So it really can't be overemphasized, these mechanisms and the various things. And also it relates to roles and responsibilities, in so much as people need to understand that they have a responsibility to do the job in a safe and effective manner, and also they have the right to withdraw from an activity that is significantly hazardous or they believe is significantly hazardous. You know, we don't want people being injured because they thought they didn't have the right to say, I think that's unsafe or whatever. That communication, that open culture of an organisation needs to be in place and may well need to develop over time. The consultation and participation of workers, like I say, the mechanisms and removal of barriers. So it's always trying to improve and enhance that activity, looking at time and resources and commitment. So people need time to be allowed to learn and understand what's required. They also need to be given time to do the job effectively and safely. They need information, communication and training. It's about non-managerial participation in the identification of hazards and controls, and the engagement with the whole of the management system is a really key element. Question here, some of the requirements of 5.4 seem impractical for large organisations to implement. I would disagree with that. The practicality of complying with it's about an organisational culture, and it should work towards delivering that transfer of information and that consultation A lot of this is done in an informal way. So a lot of the assessment process can be done via just talking to individuals. How did that happen? What did happen there? It isn't necessarily about creating loads of documented methods and procedures and controls in relation to that. It's about the relationships that go on and the actual practical application of the management standard in the real world. Communication and consultation, as I say, can be assessed in informal ways as well. So it isn't all about the documentation and documenting everything to the nth degree. It's about being reasonable, because there will be information there. And there's also about, you know, things like a suggestion scheme or hazard identification, etc., etc. If there's information there, that's also reinforcing the communication, whether it's effective, whether it's not effective. So there's all sorts of things an assessor can look at to confirm that consultation and participation is being actively engaged with, and the level of effectiveness for that can be evidenced in both the performance of the management system throughout. So it is practical, and it is an effective method of communication, and things change over time. The method, you know, the smartphones and this and that and various things. So depending on the organization and what it's trying to communicate, how that works and how it consults, can vary hugely across different organizations. So there's no one single methodology. It's about what works for your organization. That's a key element there. So in the planning section, in essence, planning is about defining actions required to successfully achieve outcomes and objectives and address risks and opportunities to meet the compliance of obligations whilst engaging with workers. All sounds very nice. That's basically what the standard is trying to achieve. The hierarchy of controls needs to be implemented where hazards have been identified, and it's about reduction of risk. So elimination being the most effective way of reducing risk. And then, as you can see there in the triangle there, the slide, it talks about substitution engineering controls, and the further down you go towards administrative controls and PPE, the least effective they become. So PPE is the last line of defense. PPE is talking about personal protective equipment. Administrative controls are the work instructions, the way the work's organized, etc., the way it's documented and how they're trained to do it. That can be very different in practice. So all too often when we're looking at performance and incidents, administrative controls, well, you know, an organization may claim to have very good administrative controls, but do they actually reflect the real life application of that worker actually performing that task and that activity in the real world? Often there's a gap between what's thought to happen and what actually happens, and often that gap is where risks and opportunities lie. This is why you need the engagement with the various workers, so that they can say, that isn't how we do it like this. Why do we do it like that? Because of this. All right, or we can. So it's about that communication process. So the delivery of an effective management system really is about that communication. Engineering controls, obviously that's looking at guarding and various things of that nature. Substitution, using something that's less hazardous or a different method in relation to an activity. So the hierarchy of control needs to be applied when you're looking at, so what can we do? How can we do that? And some of this can be influenced by external factors, changing in technology. It can be influenced by changes in skills and knowledge and understanding, etc. So it's a very fluid management system in the real world. And to be fair to ISO 45001, there's a lot of flexibility in the way it's written. It's about delivering the perceived benefit or the need for that requirement within that organization, that's what it's effectively trying to deliver. In the planning section also, we're looking at actions to address risk and opportunities as the standard developed with some changes in clauses and titles, etc. In general, it's looking at hazard identification and the risk assessments and opportunities. So, like I say, in the normal way, but it also includes commercial risk, commercial opportunities, technology change, etc., which can be, a strategic, influenced by a strategic need or a strategic requirement. Or in itself, the risk could lead to an investment in a strategic methodology or technology that improves the overall way of working. We've gone from using manual labor to an automated process. So there are risks and opportunities, both commercially and OHS terms, of introducing those changing working practices and the new resources that may be required and the new skills, etc. So all these things need to be considered as part of the activity. Determination of legal and other requirements is looking at, as it says, legal and other requirements, or the phrase compliance requirements. You call it what you need to call it. So whatever language your organization uses, as long as you understand what it is and what it's trying to deliver, that's the core process from our point of view, from an assessment. If you use the word compliance or legal and other or whatever else, it's about the effective activity that's the crucial point, not the phraseology that's used. And try and use your own language that means something within your organization. It can be very daunting for organizations starting introducing new phraseology and new terms, etc., when they've already got an established vocabulary. And if that's understood and it's effective, you don't need to use necessarily standard terms or whatever. It's just that when we ask the question, you need to point us in the right direction and say, oh, we call that whatever. So don't be frightened of using your own terminology with regard to the standard in your own documentation, because if that works for your organization, that's the critical thing. And planning to take action in 614. That's particularly important when it comes to objectives. Traditionally, it was, oh, well, you had to have objectives, etc. In this 45001 standard, it expands on that, because it's no point having an objective. I want to reduce accident rates by 50% on the previous year. Great objective. Not a problem with that. What you're going to do and how you're going to do that is what we need to know. And there needs to be plans and commitments to deliver that. So it's how you're going to get from A to B, what steps you're going to take, how you're going to monitor it, how you're going to measure it, how do you know it's achieved or done what it needed to do. They're the key messages when it talks about both objectives and planning for achievements. But also in any action, it's what you're trying to achieve. Think about that. And it sounds really obvious, but really do think about that before you implement something, because when you implement a change, you need to consider the risks of that change, the risks that may be introduced or could be greater than the benefit that you're trying to overcome. So you need to consider that change before you implement the change. think about the risks and the opportunities, what will it deliver, how will it impact on, etc., etc. So change is there's nothing really new there, but they've all the clauses have been enhanced to take you further into thinking about what you're trying to achieve, and also consider how you're then going to measure that achievement. How do you know something's achieved something if you don't know how it's measured, if you can't then prove it? Question, what are the key differences that we need to consider when migrating from 18 to 45? Hopefully, as we go through those clauses, that should be self-explanatory as we go from the clauses of 45. If you're familiar with 18, the basic principles of 18 are a very good foundation to work with. A lot of the requirements, certainly context is a new requirement. Leadership has been enhanced. Communication and participation of workers has been enhanced, and it's adopting a different structured approach in the management system. There are some core elements that remain in principle very similar: management review, internal audit, etc. But things like objectives, there's subtle changes in objectives, not just achieving, not just stating objectives, but how you're going to plan them, how you're going to plan to get to them, how you're going to apply the resources, etc., etc. So there's core differences in every clause of the management standard, but leadership, context, and as I say, all the other elements of the management standard, although they sound similar, there are key subtle differences within each clause. So as we go through each slide, you should be able to pick up the key differences that need to be considered when migrating from 18 to 45. Sorry, I can't just answer that in a simple one-liner, but certainly leadership, context are the two big changes, and documented information is another one. The way they use documented information, it's a more flexible interpretation of not just documents and records. Hopefully that's answered that question. So these management systems are based on risk and opportunities. So as you would expect, one of the core drivers of the management system is risk assessment, based on the Plan, Do, Check, Act principles. You've got the policy organisation. Based on the risk assessments, it will influence the objectives and targets. Based on the risk assessments, the controls, etc. The effectiveness of those controls and the review of performance and the review of the activity, leading to improvement, then going back to, are we delivering the policy? Is the management system helping us achieve what we need it to achieve within our organisation? The support section, section 7, gives in essence the leaders of the organisations need to provide the resources, the information necessary for the establishment, maintenance and continual improvement of the management system and the operations of the organisation as defined in the scope. It's very important that leadership isn't just seen as, yes, it is a senior management activity and there is the strategic leadership of an organisation, but you've also got leaders in terms of there might be team leaders on a particular activity, or team leaders on a particular shift, or a team leader on a particular process. That's also leadership. It's the structure and organisational structure of the company and how it functions. And all leaders need to understand what they're trying to achieve and what's a priority for the business, and looking at the protection of workers is a core requirement of that. So when we talk about leaders, don't just assume it is, managing directors and directors and senior leaders, although they're ultimately accountable and held responsible for the activities, but everybody within the organization has got their role to play within the leadership and performance of the operation. So in terms of the support activities, yes, there is the resources, including time, material, equipment, etc., information, knowledge and awareness, and maybe opportunities in relation to training. So where people haven't necessarily got the skills or the competence that you require of them, there is a development plan to get them to having the skill and the knowledge and the competence to undertake the task that you've given them. Apprentices, for example, is a classic development activity, isn't it? And there's a plan, structured plan behind that to say, right, they're going to do various things, they're going to undertake various tasks at various times, etc. And their skills and knowledge are going to develop over a period. So these things are based on both risk, but they also provide opportunity. And in essence, that's what Section 7 of the standard is looking at. It's also the awareness of individuals and the communication process within that section. So the actual clauses of Section 7 look at resources, look at competence. So there's a requirement there to define what you want as competence or what your organization defined as competence. Some of that may be influenced by legal requirements. And I'll use an example within the UK. Gas safe, for example, is a technical competence requirement that's required under legislation for anybody working with gas systems. So before you engage potentially a subcontractor, you need to make sure they are technically competent. And that also links into the statutory obligation. You've got to remember that these clauses do not work in isolation to each other. They all influence each other. So what you do, how you do it, etc., is influenced by the competence requirements. What you need to do. Is that a subcontractor? Are you going to do that in-house? If you're going to do it in-house, how do you know the guys are competent? Is it a new activity? Is it an established activity? All these things need to be considered and defined within the system. And that's dependent on your own organization. The awareness, so, it's no good saying somebody's expected to do that. They expect to, that's part of their role. But if they don't know that, how are they ever going to deliver it? They also need to be aware of the objectives, the performance activities within the organization, the policy, and various things throughout the standard. So it's how those mechanisms all come together. Communication, again, as I said, it's a key element to the standard, and the mechanisms for that are expanded. It was always part of 18,001, but it's been expanded and broken down into more relevant sections within 45. Documented information, as I say, very flexible term, means anything, and documented information isn't just traditional hard copy documents. It could be data on a spreadsheet, it could be an automated software program, etc. That's documented information and control. More increasingly in this day and age, a lot of processes and activities may well be automated and controlled by software. And so therefore, controlling that software and version controlling that, and understanding that if you introduce a new version of the software, does it still deliver and do everything that you want it to do, has got to be checked before you introduce it. Because new software revision can introduce other controls, other risks or opportunities that the previous software captured, but the new software may not deliver in the same way. So it could be a subtle change in methodology. And it's understanding that activity, especially in relation to automated processes, that's quite critical. But the requirements for documented information are, it could be many and varied, and it's a generic term to capture this. So it's not about, it may be stuff that you already routinely do. Why do you capture that data? Why do you monitor that? Why do you do this? These are all things that you may well already exist within your management system. And a key element of this management system 45001 is to link in with existing operational controls. So it isn't just about, oh, well, we make widgets on a day-to-day basis, and then we've got to do some health and safety stuff. It's we make widgets considering the health and safety implications as an active process. That's what it's about. Integrating it into the normal operations of a company. A lot of this may already be considered. As I say, there's been various changes when the standard was developed from its draft status. The clause 8.1 operational planning and control is a relatively small clause in terms of text within the standard. But it's a core activity. The actual operation and what you do is at the core of how you keep people safe. So although it's a relatively small clause in text terms, in reality, it's a fundamental major issue, because we're not talking about theoretical protection. We're talking real life, life-changing operational control. So that's where the standard is trying to go away from, oh, well, we've got control because we've got loads of documents and procedures and whatever. It's saying, but do they work? Are they applied? Does it work in real terms? How do you know? How do you measure it? And that's a key fundamental requirement of this management system, is actually looking at your operation. In 8.2, you've got emergency preparedness and response. There isn't a great deal of change there, in fairness. There's one or two word changes or whatever, but it's foreseeing what can be applicable to you as an emergency, having suitable resources and plans in place to respond to that emergency should it arise, and actually implementing some training and some things in relation to that emergency response. It's no good waiting until the event actually happens to find out that your fire alarm doesn't work. So you may well have practice drills and other mechanisms in place for ensuring that those resources and those procedures and the various things are effective should they need to be used in anger. And that's the core of clause 8.2. Performance evaluation. Like I say, there's been a range of changes there. The monitoring and measurement. The evaluation and monitoring and measurement of the performance of the system is an important element, because how can you say that the management system is effective if you aren't analysing the information that's being generated and the data and the various things? Is it delivering the need? That's the core. This is what this clause is talking about. And also in there is the evaluation of compliance. So when it talks about legal and other requirements, and we've got to comply with this piece of legislation and that piece of legislation, and this is what it means to us. Well, that knowledge in itself is not confirming that your performance is actually achieving that. There's got to be mechanisms in there to confirm that you're delivering that need. And that's what the evaluation of compliance. So it isn't just maintaining an up-to-date register of legal compliance or other requirements. It's actually saying, and what we do, our controls actually effectively deliver that, or our actions effectively deliver that. It's a key element of performance evaluation, is the evaluation of compliance. Internal audits is one method of looking at the performance. So it's a requirement of the standard to look at internal auditing, and that's basically looking at your controls and your procedures and the various things that you've got that are applicable to you, and ensuring that the management system is delivering what you need it to deliver, and that the controls are effectively implemented, etc. So internal audits is a key activity, and it can also be used to influence other things such as the evaluation of compliance, etc., etc. So it's a very flexible, and it should also be risk-based, based on the significance of the activity, the historic performance of a particular activity, and the information that's being generated by other elements of the management system. So internal audits is a very useful requirement within the standard for numerous other elements. And as I say, it should be risk-based and significance-based on your own requirements there. Management review, there's one or two wording changes within that in terms of 18,001. However, the basic principles remain the same. It's looking at the effective implementation of the management system overall, delivery of objectives, confirmation of policy, etc. And if there are any changes needed, both in terms of revised objectives, status of corrective actions, etc., etc., all need to be. So it's looking at the overall performance of the management system. Do not confuse management review with operational review. Your operational review may be looking at specific requirements and may cover some elements of management review, but management review has a lot of key requirements that need to be followed. Section 10 is looking at improvements. An enhancement of performance is a fundamental objective of the management system. So the general requirements there. There's also requirements that look at incidents, non-conformity and actions. So that's in section 10. And it's also an important point that actions need to be reviewed for their effectiveness. So just implementing something doesn't confirm that it's delivered the benefit. You need to review that action and confirm that it's actually delivered the benefit. And before you implement any action, you need to consider the risks and opportunities of making that change, because an action is a change. You're changing something, you're doing something different. So you need to consider what impact that action has, how that's implemented, is there any other changes that may be needed as part of that, and also the review the effectiveness of that action post-implementation to confirm that, yep, that's done what we wanted it to do. And the requirement for continual improvement, obviously objectives and processes. Continual improvement should be a natural output from the management system overall. If you effectively implement your objectives and your plans, and you look at corrective actions, and you look at reducing risk and delivering your policy, then continual improvement should be a natural output. You may want to define specific improvement points via your objectives, but continual improvement should be a natural outcome from the implementation of an effective management system. And it's also about not just maintaining the status quo. You know, oh, well, we had so many injuries last year, we accept we're going to have that many injuries again, or that many actions, or that many incidents, or this type of activity. You've got to think about what improvements you can make within your organisation to drive forward that improvement, because it is a requirement of the standard. But as I say, in a lot of cases, it will be a natural outcome of just had a question. One of our audience members was distracted and they missed some of the presentation. As I say, everybody who's registered will receive the presentation. It's also been recorded and it will be available via NQA website, so you can listen back and you'll have the presentation, etc. So it should be available to at your convenience to review and capture. So that's a very quick overview of 45001. 45 is a very different standard to 18, although 18 gives some very good fundamental foundations on which to build. There's nothing in 45 which contradicts 18. Generally, there are enhancements and additional requirements specifically in relation to what's trying to be achieved. That I would say is and it's also designed to fit with other management systems. So if you've already got 9001, 2015 version, etc., then you may well find there's some harmonization in the structure which makes it less bureaucratic to make those systems work together. If you think of the primary drivers of the OHS management system, you've got risks and opportunities, you've got the leadership and the strategic direction of the business, and you've also got compliance requirements. And I think those three things are some of the core drivers of the management system throughout. The context of the organisation is the internal and external issues and the needs of expectations of the interested parties. The output is fulfilment of requirements, enhanced performance, reduced risk, increased protection to workers, and continued satisfaction of obligation requirements. For those of you who need some additional support or look at the various things in relation to migrating from 18,000 to 45,001, we've produced a number of documents that can help you. These are available via our website. For NQA clients directly, we can come in and provide a gap analysis service for you, looking at where your existing system is with 18 and looking at the requirements of 45,001. So it's basically a good gap analysis to give you some clear pointers if there are any deficiencies or any weaknesses within the existing system because it is a new approach, a new way of looking at the various requirements of the clauses. It can give you a very strong emphasis for moving forward. We're now halfway through the migration period between when 45001 was published in March 2018. So officially 18001 will not be auditable after March 2021. Sounds a long way off, but I can guarantee you that will move very quickly, and you should be considering and making changes now, whether you're having formal assessments to 45 or not. You should be developing your system with a view to 45001, because I guarantee that time will go very quickly. 2021 may seem a long way away, but it will go very quickly. From those of you who are starting from scratch, if there is anyone out there that's just looking at 45 as the first stab at introducing an OHS management system, then have available to you the standard. It's really important that you have that structure in front of you that you can refer to. There is also a lot of help and support within the standard, the way it's written. So there's the terms and definitions, and also at the back of the standard, there is some annexes that explain the requirements in a bit more detail, although very generically about context, etc. Look at identify your sources of legal compliance and your other requirements and how you keep up to date with those. Look at any existing hazard and risk assessments and also consider opportunities. And if you don't have an external third party coming in to do a gap analysis, using the standard, by all means compile your own gap analysis, read the standard, look at where you think you've got something existing and look at to see if that meets the requirements. In terms of anybody migrating, it says again, read the standard, either consider an external gap analysis or conduct your own, and do the mapping exercise between the requirements of 45 and what you've already got in place. A lot of the challenges that we see when we're doing assessments, to some extent, is not that an organisation isn't doing it, it's just that on the day of the assessment or the days of assessment, it can be quite intense and it can be difficult to identify exactly where in your organisation that information is, or etc. So it can be a very useful activity as a preparation process for you to go through that mapping exercise and think, well, I think our requirements for that are held there or held here. And remember, it's including every element of the organisation. It doesn't have to be called occupational health and safety to be part of the management system. It's just the way you operate, everything there. So it doesn't have to have that in the title, but it could be the way you operate. So has anyone else got any questions? If that's the end of the questions, then thank you for your attendance, and I look forward to sending out the information and the presentation. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a good weekend. Be safe. Cheers. Thank you.